Today's webinar is titled The Savvy Investor's Guide for Doing Business in China, and our guest presenter is Dr. Gary Bonvillian. Dr. Bonvillian currently serves as Senior Director of International Programs and Research for the Lotus Education Group in Xiamen, China. Previously, Dr. Bonvillian was President of Thomas University, an independent, co-educational, liberal arts-based university located in Thomasville, Georgia. The university operated 3 of only 4 government-approved foreign programs of nursing in the People's Republic of China, as well as baccalaureate in business. Prior to Thomas University, Dr. Bonvillian was the Provost and VP for Academic Affairs at Cayuga College. Under his leadership, Cayuga established 18 satellite teaching locations across New York State and developed the largest foreign higher education program operating in the People's Republic of China with 3,500 students. Over the course of his career, Dr. Bonvillian has served as Dean of the School of Business and Professional Studies at Mesa University and the Associate Dean in the College of Business at Florida Gulf Coast University. He was also a member of the faculty and administration of RIT for 20 years, joining the university originally within the Division of Records and Institutional Research, and holding many roles and special assignments, including Associate Dean of the College of Business. He holds a PhD from SUNY Buffalo and both a master's and bachelor's degree from RIT. Dr. Bonvillian has researched, taught, published, and consulted on the subjects of leadership, management, international business, total quality, organizational development, and leading change. A proud double alumnus of RIT, please welcome Dr. Bonvillian. We are happy to have you here with us today. Our audience is all yours.
Thank you so much. I'm very pleased to be able to be back connected with RIT and perhaps contribute something to people's knowledge today about quite a complex subject, but relevant to all of us. I'm going to spend just a few minutes giving you background information, which you'll find is all relevant for my later presentation on some facts and figures about China and what it takes to try to succeed there. First of all, I first went into China in 2002 with an opportunity to connect with their higher education institutions there at the time. At that time, unlike today, we were welcomed with open arms, and I often tell people that if you were an American college or university, there was eagerness beyond anybody's expectations here to try to get connected and do business with these folks. As a consequence of that, I did have success in 13 different colleges and universities over the years that I've been able to pull together joint programs with them. I would like to say, though, too, that I've had as many failures, and probably more than that over the years, too. Some of the reasons for that I'll be presenting today in this presentation. We stayed connected. I stayed connected with the people in China, which led to my current role as a consultant with this group, the Lotus Education Group. I do research, I do liaison work, and I act as an advisor to some of their newest ventures. As I was pulling this material together, I thought to myself I could do another entire book, I'm certain, about the difference between 2002 and 2019 over these many years. That said, what I'm going to do today is give you the high points from all of the chapters in the book, starting with the history and elements of culture and trying to understand the people of China, because to be successful on the business front in China, you had better have a good grounding in all of these things. Otherwise, it's probably not going to work out. The project started out as a book on modern China, not about a book on doing business in China. The topics, however, that you could see in this book do cover all of the elements that I would have put in that original format of, well, what is it really like in China today? Finally, I want to say that I had 13 other contributing writers to this book, all of whom worked in China, and many lived there for many years, very accomplished in their field, and this book project would not have occurred without that kind of support. So why did I even think about doing a book on China, other than the fact that I've actually been there 20 times over the years? But never considered myself an expert, not by any means. That's why I say I could probably not have done this book entirely on my own. I felt motivated because of the growing power and influence of China in the world, and frankly, and to be blunt about it, how little I felt people know about China, particularly here in the U.S., and I really felt an obligation to share things that I've learned over the years that might give people a better perspective of this significant nation, and also a little preparation for the future. No small factor was my grandsons, who I know are going to deal with China far more than I ever did growing up and in their professional careers. So when I looked at, well, what should we talk about? Certainly history and the culture. I'm going to share a lot more detail in a moment. Their business practices, the motivations of China, ambitions, leadership, and who's in charge today, and how they go about decision making. There have been other books written about China, but none cover the range of topics that we do in this book. And I felt good about that, particularly as the project concluded. And also, frankly, with the current events with China, which is actually influencing our sales here in this book, because China and U.S. relationships is in the news every single day today and actually moves about from week to week. So perhaps this is more relevant than ever. We can't really today, and I think that most economists would agree, we really can't predict the future of all of this for China or for us as a result of this growing empire and presence across the world. That said, I am absolutely confident in saying we are affected every single day by the actions of China as consumers, as citizens of the U.S., and I think that's going to continue for quite some time. I tried to go beyond the geographics and the demographics of the country to try to make a case for this is what China is like today, because we often look at China and simply say, well, it's a very large nation and they have influence because of that. Well, there are many other reasons beyond that factor, and I'm going to share those with you. So, quick look at the history. China is very proud of its heritage, which goes back around 5,000 years. There have been significant ups and downs to that history, including a dark period where they weren't really engaged in leading in the rest of the world as they had even in their earliest days. 10 dynasties ruled China for approximately 2,000 years, beginning with Qi Shi Huang, whose burial place is in the ancient city of Xi'an. If you ever have an opportunity to see the terracotta warriors, that's where they are. That first emperor did begin to break down those internal borders and start to unify the country, which led further to even more significant unification in their presence today. The fall of the dynasties really occurred because of the Chinese Revolution, and the Qing dynasty was in place at that time. There were events that led up to that are worth mentioning. Several most significant. First and Second Opium Wars, certainly in the mid-1800s, was the entree of a great deal of foreign domination and concessions to the rest of the world. And that's probably the beginning of that dark period that I previously mentioned. The system, though, began to take even much greater and constructive shape under Sun Yat-sen, who was the leader of the Nationalist Party and established really a central government in China in 1912. He was instrumental in overthrowing that last dynasty and began to form what we really know today as Central China. Worth mentioning historically, though, is that prior to those Opium Wars, China was the largest economy in the world. Sun Yat-sen is considered the father of modern China. You see this all over the country as you're traveling through, and they're celebrating their history. And eventually, when he passed away in 1929, Chiang Kai-shek took over, and I think most of us know who Chiang Kai-shek was. However, and unfortunately, there was tension within the party, and Mao Zedong led a group of revolutionists and, frankly, won that turf battle, and Chiang Kai-shek had to move out of power in 1949, and of course he fled to Taiwan, and you know the Taiwan of today. China, though, at that point became the Republic of China. And in the Republic of China now, there are certain elements at the time and still today that are very influential in how business is done and how people live their lives. I'll mention Confucianism from time to time because although China is actually an atheist state, the principles of Confucius have been resurrected of late for a variety of reasons, but most importantly is that the Confucius principles include a commitment to something beyond the individual, also an order to social living and a loyalty and a discipline in behavior. And the government has actually seized this in recent years, and they use now the Confucius principles to drive some of their decision-making and influence across all of their citizenship. The communist rule, of course, I think most of us know, began with Mao Zedong's victory in 1949 and has been in place ever since. Interesting, if you travel to China, you will see Mao Zedong celebrated all over the country in many ways. And I've heard more than once, and this is not meant to just make a joke, but I've heard more than once he was a great leader who made one mistake. And of course, that one mistake was the Cultural Revolution between 1966 and 1976. That was a significant setback for China in the progress that it had been making up until that point. And I saw the effects of that even in 2002. In higher education, there were many professors who lost their positions and could not practice during that period of time and really stalled the advancement of their higher education system. And as a visiting American bringing our programs there, we had to accommodate that, or we would not have those programs that we eventually created. Now, that a lot has changed since then, since 2002, and now I would say that their higher education system and, of course, their credentialing of professors and the pathway to excellence for those schools is becoming quite modernized and advanced and worthy of attention from all of the world. The point of state capitalism has to be brought up because in a communist government, there is still significant control, if not total control, over all business applications that occur in China, whether they are government run or privately run. I'll say something about private business here in a bit, or from international corporations that are operating in China. State capitalization is still the rule of the day in terms of how business is done. So I want to take just a few moments to look at culture. Although the Han Chinese is the majority group in China, it's worth mentioning that there are 200 different dialects in China, which sometimes causes a bit of an issue, but I wouldn't say significant. I've traveled the country from the farthest northern points to the most southern points in east and west, and never seen this as a major obstacle for people doing business with each other. And I'm often asked, well, do you speak Chinese? The answer is no. I always have had interpreters, and even in those 17 years, the advancement of English language skills has been extraordinary amongst all citizens. So cultural-wise, let me share right now what I consider one of the highest points that we need to understand if we are going to attempt to do business in China, and that's all about relationships. In Asian societies, not just China, the individual is defined by their relationship to the larger group. And there is prestige, of course, in certain groups over other groups. Also, in social interaction, you have to be willing to invest a lot of time for relationships to percolate. I have had engagements with senior people in China, both at the government level and in higher education at the highest ranks, where initially there might be a very standoffish feeling from them, and I feel as though I'm not going to get anywhere. But then upon return and subsequent visits and engagement and discussions, it can go all the way to really deep friendships, which I've always enjoyed over the years. So as Americans, we have to be patient and let those relationships evolve if they have a chance to do that. This is all part of the elements of the protocol that we all have to respect and abide by if we want to do serious business with the Chinese. And the failure to do that will also fail in your ability to actually conduct business and be successful. Another element of their culture that we need to respect and isn't always easy for Americans is patience. We are known for lacking patience, and sometimes that can surface in the way we engage others, and I've seen that as well in China when we're trying to put a deal together. The Chinese, and quite frankly, I was listening to the news this morning, I'm sure all of you have, about China relationships, and it was mentioned that new information was introduced in these discussions about the trade barriers and tariffs, and this is in my notes that indeed that's part of their tactic. They may introduce new information. They'll let discussions be drawn out for long periods of time, and you wonder if we're even on the same page at all anymore. Sometimes, though, this is merely a tactic to gain an upper hand in the discussion and have the ability to perhaps enhance the deal. My message here is you must be prepared for a long courtship with the Chinese if you want to do business with them, because no decisions are going to be made quickly, particularly today, more so than ever from my early days. The other cultural element, which is and perhaps even the most critical on how you get through successful enterprises, is Guao Shi. Now, Guao Shi, simply put, represents the individual's networking of power, who you know, and where they stand in the hierarchy of a particular group. I think I'm safe in saying that no business is conducted whatsoever, whether you are an insider or outsider in China, without Guao Shi at work. And it's not long to discover this as you begin to interact with people and see where they are in the hierarchy. And the hierarchy of personal relationships is essential for you to know. For instance, before I ever went into any discussions, even if it seemed to be a casual visit at a school, it might be wanting to meet the president and the party secretary. Before I went in, I would always ask my handlers there, who is the most important person in the room? And it may not be who you think. The president may not be the most important person at the university. In fact, that person is probably not. It is the party secretary. So we need to know who that is and how to conduct ourselves around that individual. If you don't do this and you violate protocol in terms of recognition of their position, then your deal is probably ended before it even has a chance to begin. Also, the Chinese place a premium on social capital with their group of friends and relatives and close associates, and they believe in mutual obligation. My partners there often say, well, we have to create win-win or a win-win-win. Everybody has to win in whatever we come up with here. And that also means if they do something for me, then I am expected to do something for them, whatever that might be. This can be delicate at times when you're walking through negotiations because you may be asked to do things that you say, well, I just can't. And in higher education, we came to that very quickly in terms of our academic standards and our checks and balances in higher ed to assure quality in everything that we do. In the early days, there were many times when I said, no, we cannot operate that way in China. We have to operate the same way we operate in the U.S., so this will not work out in the long run. And particularly in my business, I always pointed out it would only take one time where we violate those principles, and that would probably be the end of the program. Another cultural element, and I'm sure you've all heard of this, has to do with face. That refers to personal dignity, prestige, and status, which is honored by the people of China to maintain harmony and good social relationships, and also to recognize that hierarchy that I just addressed. To make somebody lose face in public would be one of the most significant mistakes to make with the Chinese. And it's not easy to avoid that at times because we don't know the people well enough to know what they're thinking about certain topics. And the lesson there is to simply be cautious and respectful all the time. And you'll lead into conversations with folks, and then they'll begin to give you license to be a little bit more relaxed in your exchange. And to the point where, and I did this many times over the years, I got to know people from multiple trips, and we could laugh and joke and make fun of each other without any problems whatsoever. But it took time for that to develop. I had one incident where I brought somebody over from one of my schools. We were trying to make a deal for a program, and this staff person at the dinner table began to lecture the Chinese partners on what was really going on in their country, presuming that she knew more than them. And I knew I was going to hear about that immediately after dinner, and I did. Fortunately, she corrected that, and we had a good visit in the end. But it's that kind of protocol that simply cannot be violated. Education, of course, is highly regarded in China and absolutely essential for advancement in society today and to living the best life you possibly can. The consequences, though, of that have been very, I would say, influential in changes in what has been made available to the Chinese society for going to school. When I went there in 2002, I don't have today's data, but I do know between the year 2000 and around 2005, 500 new colleges and universities were built in China. Far more than that have been built since then because of the tremendous demand. Back in those days, the Chinese government was not interested in any kind of private education, nor were they interested in any kind of distance education, which is of course, commonplace here in the U.S. Today, neither one of those things is true. The government now invests in private education. I've seen public-private partnerships. I actually had a deal. One of those 13 schools was actually a university that was funded by private enterprises as well as the Chinese government. And distance education, they're now deeply engaged in it and have pretty significant and very effective means to reaching their population through distance ed. With respect to the language, I mentioned earlier English. Know that young people begin taking English in elementary grades. They take it throughout their schooling and many courses in English in their baccalaureate degree if they get to college in order to get that degree. And they have to do well in it. Language barrier was somewhat of an inconvenience in 2002. I found over the years that it's not consequential at all. today because the language has spread so much, and of course, young people are much better prepared. Lastly, on this idea of culture, there is something called Confucius Institutes. They are all over the world, around 500 of them. We've had as many as 70 here in the U.S., and although they've been a little bit controversial with some American academicians, for the most part, they have been very effective in bridging the gap between our societies. I'm going to give you some now hard data. One of the things I said to my writers is I want factual information as it relates specifically to doing business, and also opportunities and obstacles for those who might be considering it. So for this particular slide and this particular chapter in the book, let me give you a little bit of data. First of all, China is has the second largest inward foreign investment in the world at $171 billion. They are the largest exporter to the world, with the U.S. at $2.26 trillion. They also hold the largest amount of foreign exchange reserves with the U.S. at around, well, a little over $3 trillion. And they have around $217 billion in outward foreign direct investment with the U.S. And in fact, the Chinese are second only to the U.S. now in multinational corporations.
Gary?
Not surprised. Yes.
We do have one question.
Good.
An audience member is asking if you can describe what a Confucianist Institute is.
Okay. Very good question. A Confucius Institute is typically established on a university campus around the world, although we've had as many as 70 here in the U.S. And they are funded jointly by the American school as well as the Chinese. Staff are brought from China, and the Confucius Institute might engage in joint research with people on that American campus. They would most certainly be offering classes to better understand Asian culture and specifically China, and they might even be the breeding ground for new ventures, even business ventures, and an incubator sense between the U.S. and China. That's the kind of role that they have tried to play. Some controversy has arisen about the Confucius Institutes because in higher ed and only in certain areas, this has not been significant, only in certain areas that some folks have felt, well, that's a little bit too much influence from the Chinese. Let me say there's a term out there that's been used for decades, long before all of this, called soft power in politics. And frankly, Western nations have engaged in soft power for most of their history, and that is going to other countries and influencing them in soft ways to guide them in the direction that we think is most beneficial to everyone. The Chinese see Confucius Institutes as an element of soft power. This has been said publicly by them. Again, some folks don't appreciate that notion. Others say it's pretty commonplace and always has been. So there you go. So if you see a Confucius Institute established at a university, those are the activities they are probably engaged in. Okay? So continuing on with this element of business systems, state-controlled enterprises, of course, have the greatest privilege in the country. They have greater access to capital and to the financial institutions, which are also controlled by the state. This is not to say privatization is not encouraged and fostered. Indeed, it is. There's a growing private sector element in China. I should say 85% of those are actually family-owned business, and then 15% are simply private enterprises. And the government does encourage this, and they try to support that agenda as much as possible. However, of course, state-controlled enterprises still have the upper hand in the business climate there. I should say this, and I can say it with confidence. I've met many, many entrepreneurs, successful entrepreneurs in China over the years, and every one of them either had connection with the central government or the party itself, might even be party members, or the military, or had extraordinary family connections. Again, Guaoxi comes into play here in terms of your ability to navigate through their system successfully. You would run into, if you visit China, I encourage everybody should visit China at least once, you would see that they have enterprises of all size and shape, from modest little retail shops with incredibly low prices all the way up to the highest price that you could ever pay in any major city in the world for some goods and services. So both exist there. On that last point about Guaoxi and doing business in their business system, I tell everybody you have to have good partners there, a good agent, whatever you call them. Somebody has to be there on that end to help you guide through the system. I've never known anybody to go in successfully in China and operate entirely on their own, independently, without internal support. I certainly could not have done this. With respect to business and workforce development, there is a problem in China, and it's really going to come to the head in the next 20 to 30 years, and that is they actually have a shrinking workforce because of the one-child policy. And we know right now, given current data, that their workforce is probably going to shrink by about 20% within the next 30 years. And of course, there's a disproportionate ratio of men to women because of that one-child policy as well, and this is going to cause them some demographic issues also. Opportunities in business. 3 areas come to mind, and we cover these quite a bit in the book, and that is healthcare development. There is really phenomenal to just watch it take place for me over these 17 years, how far they've come. A lot of it now styled after Western models. So healthcare, lots of opportunities for investors. Education is another area because they still cannot educate all the people who want education. So that opens many doors. And then finally, environmental management, and you'll see why in a moment when I get into some of the environmental data. Very quickly on technology, we put in one chapter on technology because data, when we talk about technology, usually gets people's attention right away. And China embraces the advancement of technology, and they are working vigorously, very fast, on building their infrastructure. They want to become a world manufacturing power, and they will use cyber connectivity and intelligence in manufacturing in ways that others are going to be scrambling to try to catch up with. They're integrating the internet technologies with manufacturing today as we speak, and I think we can expect to see many things on the horizon for them. But in terms of data, we know, those who study information technology know that we're now in the 4th industrial revolution because of technology, which really fuses technology in virtually all walks of life, and we obviously see that today. Projections are 5 to 10 million jobs a year are going to be lost to technological advances. So this is a worldwide phenomenon. China's economy has grown a great deal because of their technology investments, though. As an example, in as far back as 2013, and I don't even have the current data, China experienced $300 billion in U.S. dollars in e-tailing sales, electronic sales. Their digital economy reached $3.4 trillion in 2016, and they ranked second in the world with their digital economy. They predict, I think it will happen, that their internet contributions to China's productivity could be up by 22% within the next 6 years or so. It was projected and did occur that China would reach 1/3 of all industrial robot installations in the world by 2018. So in spite of the tremendous size of the population, and you might think availability of workers, and they take jobs away from us, there are actually more jobs available than they can fill with people right now with their current demographics. One last point on this slide. Many, many years ago when I was still at RIT, Bill Wigenhorn, who was a senior executive at Motorola, and I'm talking early 90s, said, we're going into China because that's the future with telephones, and they did, and now everyone has a cell phone in China, and they did not invest in big infrastructure as other countries, including us, did in landline technology. I'll say something here about social development. We've devoted a whole chapter to this because I've said for years, I think their greatest challenge is still trying to deal with such a large population that's almost overwhelming at times when you're there and you see it face to face. And that is continue to eradicate poverty, get people employed, give them decent working conditions, let people feel included, and access to education and health care, drinking water, safe drinking water, sanitation, and so on. It is a tremendous burden for China to address all of these things. The disabled, indigenous people, and elderly, very, very difficult for them to deal with all of this now simply because of the sheer size of the country. But they are making much progress. I've seen that in hospitals. I've toured hospitals all of my trips there. And I cannot believe the advancements that they've made and the size and availability too of services. They have reduced poverty a great deal just in recent years. They do have, as we have in this country, though, quite a gap, and it's growing between the really poor and the really rich. However, they're focused on trying to still eliminate that poverty. The government expects that anybody doing business in China will adhere to their corporate social responsibility principles, and there are rules that you have to follow in order to do that. You can look this up. It's all over the internet what that means. Not that difficult to do, but certainly expected. Public-private partnerships are very popular now. As I said, at one time that wasn't so much the case, but today it's not unusual to see the government investing directly in private enterprises, including visiting foreign investors. Excuse me. There has been a significant change, of course, in everyday life in China, and many people enjoy the advancements that they've made. More data. I call this the attention-getting data in the book, and that is China has emerged as the second largest economy in the world at $10 trillion, second only to the U.S. It could surpass, and many predict it will surpass the U.S. in the next 20 years. More than 500 million people have come out of poverty in China. The urban areas, of course, are swelling almost to unhealthy levels, but that is what's happening, exodus from the rural areas. China overtook the U.S. in mergers and acquisitions at $174 billion in 2016. And even in the next 10 years, China's workforce will still account for about 12% of all global spending. There are, as of 2017, China had more than 730 million internet users, which is 52% of the entire online population. You can see how these numbers, as I say, get your attention and are hard to ignore. Therefore, China is a difficult place to ignore because it affects our everyday lives. We call it the disruptive force, both positive and negative, on all nations around them. So it's a matter of how you're going to deal with this. When President Deng Xiaoping opened the markets of China in '79, this really began their movement to where they are today as this economic powerhouse. And the current president, of course, Xi Jinping, is even more aggressive today. They want to lead, not to follow anymore. They'd like to engage their Asian neighbors and have more influence on them. There's some resistance. If you travel to other nations in the area, as I have, you will see this firsthand, that those nations have similar aspirations and not really eager to be dominated by China. Keep an eye on the Belt and Road Initiative. Again, this is all over the internet. You can look that up. This is staggering. 70 countries from Asia, Africa, and Europe. Coalition to do business with each other and make business easier to do with each other. How this will work out in the long run, no one really knows just yet. But as a coalition, as a force together, it is formidable and perhaps the most formidable coalition we've ever seen economically in the world. Of course, we know every day now, we see in the news the back and forth between China and the U.S., our presidents. We don't know where this is going to go yet. And I'm not going to get into a political discussion about the merits of all that, but it does affect us. One word from our president about relationships with China can drive or drop the stock market by 500 points. We've seen this over and over again here in recent years. The most important lesson right now, though, for those looking into China is that China has opened itself up to the rest of the world ever since becoming a member of the World Trade Organization in 2001. That was really the moment where China said, look, we welcome your business. Let's see what we can do together. I want to say something quickly about the environment, and I asked for a whole chapter to be devoted to this in the book because they do have serious problems. Air pollution has contributed to around 300,000 premature deaths per year, according to the World Health Organization. Another study from them shows that hazardous air pollutants revealed 1.2 million deaths in 2013 alone. Solid fuels used there contributes to almost 500,000 deaths a year. Over 200 major rivers in China are deeply polluted so badly they can't even be used for agricultural irrigation. 70% of the world's electronic waste is generated in China. And then finally, China is the largest contributor to greenhouse gases, almost 30%. So these are big issues, not only affecting China, but also affecting the rest of the world. And of course, if you take a trip there and you go into any one of their major cities, you will see this firsthand, and it can be a little uncomfortable. Let me, on this last slide, make a few compelling points here. So what does China want with this very aggressive agenda they have in place now, and where's it all going? Well, certainly they want to raise the standard of living of their people. They are committed to innovate and not just emulate, and a lot of folks still today who I interact with here in the U.S. say, well, they just want to copy everything we do. No. That may have been the case at one point, but that's certainly not the case today. Their investment is in innovation. They want to lead rather than follow other great nations, and they do have aspirations to be right at the top. Right now, everyone knows the two most powerful nations are the U.S. and China, and there may be back and forth for many years to come because of that. Frankly, even with all the tariff discussions right now, both nations need each other desperately in order to succeed. I'm hoping that that is the reason things will get worked out for both nations, because of that very reason. They do, of course, embrace their communist ideology and feel that it has to stay in place in order for them to stay on this positive path they're on now for both economic growth and world leadership. Some people are troubled by this, but believe it or not, there are American political pundits and economists here who have written and said, when the Chinese government changed their constitution a little over a year ago, which allowed Xi Jinping to be essentially a president for life, there were some shocked at that and said, we got away from that after Mao. But others say it's that kind of control that's needed today in order to manage this massive change that is underway. Fact is, the jury is still out on whether that's going to end up working. Personally, I've always been troubled by the notion that you can encourage free enterprise on one hand and then have such a controlling, strong fist in the other. But I'm not an economist either, so we don't really know. It's still up in the air how most outsiders will look at China. Do they see it as an opportunity or a threat? I will tell you that the contributors to this book, in the end, without my encouraging them one way or the other, all my writers had a chance to state their own case. As my publisher said, at the end of the day, all of you said you should look at China, and yes, there are opportunities, and you should not be afraid to move in that direction. However, you have to be patient. You have to not be intimidated by what looks like the unknown. You have to find the right connections in country in order to help lead the way in that pathway for you. Otherwise, it probably would not work. Let me say this. I see we only have about 5 minutes or so left. I've been there 20 times. I have not been there now in 2 years. I was supposed to go last year, and for the first time in all of those years, I was denied entry by the government. I had my visa in hand, and 1 week before the trip, the government stepped in and said, we're going to do a background check on this fellow. And they did with one of my partners also, and that trip was called off. My partner, who's actually was born in mainland China but is an American citizen, his response to that was, well, it's like the old days. This is what we're experiencing again. For me, that makes it a little bit of an unknown to my own future, although I'm still consulting and under contract with this group in China. I haven't been back in 2 years. If I tried to go back now, would I be denied again? I honestly don't know without trying that. But there are elements of the old days, as Michael said to me once, and I have a feeling that has much to do with the current relationships with the U.S. I think it's affecting our book, and we've looked into publishing this book in China as well. We are so candid in this book, I think if we did publish it in China, I think that would clinch it, and they would definitely not let me back in because we didn't hold anything back in our assessment of what you need to consider when looking at China today. On the other hand, as I said, we also ended the book by saying we would encourage those who have the means to do it, the ability to do it, the desire, the drive, and the tolerance to look at opportunities in China. There are still many for investors. So that is it. That's as fast as I can get through that much material in a book of this size, and I hope that it's helped you in some way consider not just doing business in China, but just having a relationship with China and how it's going to influence our children and particularly our grandchildren in years to come. I fear that if we as Americans don't invest in better understanding all people around the world, not just the Chinese, but certainly the Chinese, then we will only suffer for that. And there's no better place to start than in the educational venue. Sadly, the number of Chinese students coming to the U.S. has dropped precipitously over the last 2 years, and that's been worrisome in the academy, and frankly does not benefit any of us. Having a healthy exchange of students, that next generation to lead the world, is one of the best things we can do to keep peace and harmony and success for everybody. So thank you for your time and energy, and I will be signing off at this point.
Okay, thank you so much, Gary. That's all the time we have for today. Additional questions can be emailed to ritalum@rit.edu or tweeted to @ritalumni with the hashtag #MeRITWebinars, and we will direct your questions to Dr. Bonvillian. Note that all participants will receive an email from us within the next week with a link to today's webinar recording. Our next webinar will be held in June, and our presenter will be our RIT Alumni Association Board President. Look for an email invitation coming soon. Thanks again to Dr. Bonvillian for presenting today, and many thanks to our audience for taking time out of your day to be with us.